Hello and welcome to my talk about using postcards for our family history and also in connection with places perhaps where our ancestors lived. Now usually I'm talking about postcards in a context of who sent or received them, but today I'm going to be talking about the images, and I've chosen as an example the mill pond in Swanage. Now, I grew up in Swanage and it's a very busy seaside town, but in the centre, next to the parish church, the mill pond really is an oasis of tranquility. But it's also perhaps somewhere that you might believe is timeless. But of course, everything changes over a period of time, doesn't it? And if you're looking for postcards that show views that would be familiar with your ancestors, I want to highlight perhaps some of the issues you might have in making the correct choice of the view. Now, this postcard was sent in 1904, so we know the image predates that. And I just want to draw your attention to the red line in the foreground next to the wall and between where the cottages begin. Now in 1909 you can see really that there's not much change, is there? And unfortunately the viewpoint is above the other one, so you can't see where that wall is, but you can see in the very far distance Ballard Down, which is that hill. Now Ballard Down leads to the sea and Old Harry Rocks, which you might have heard of. Now today if you were to stand in this position you wouldn't be able to see the hill. Trees have grown up, buildings have been erected, and so it's slightly different beyond the edge of those cottages around the mill pond itself. Now in 1923 we're looking back across Church Hill, and the buildings around the mill pond are looking a little bit dilapidated, aren't they? And the buildings behind, actually in Church Hill itself, there's a certain rundown feeling to them perhaps. Now this postcard was sent in 1945, and you can see that the wall around the edge of the mill pond is there, but I want to draw your attention to where that red arrow is and those buildings, and also to the cottages on the left, because you can see how much they've deteriorated. But the important thing with this postcard is that that view didn't exist in 1945. Swanage was affected by bombing during the Second World War in the early part of the war. And this stretch of Swanage, which feeds down from the high street, was bombed. There was a large number of buildings that were lost, and also a loss of life as well. So in 1945, that view didn't exist. Interestingly, in the postcard from 1912 and 1945, you can see that the photographer has chosen to have the washing on the lines. And although today perhaps we might not think that you'd want the washing out in such an image, it's history, isn't it? It's history, seeing people's washing drying on the line, although we are going back to that method, aren't we, ourselves, sort of trying to not use our tumble dryers quite so much. Fast forward onto the 1960s and we can see that there's still a gap between the wall and the cottages of the mill pond, although remarkably those cottages have been completely renovated, almost rebuilt, separated into separate dwellings. On the right you can see a detached perfect stone building, and that was built in the 1950s on the site of where those cottages had been bombed, and eventually it became the rectory for St Mary's Church. And in the foreground of the church I've put a red arrow, and you can see corrugated tin roof, and that was used for small groups, reading groups mainly, to use. It's not large enough, it's not like a village hall, it's not that kind of building. Fast forward again to the 1970s, and that tin building is still there, but you can see on the right that the wall has been extended and there's a gate joining the wall to the edge of the cottages, because that stretch is private property. And apart from the fear that children would fall down the steps there, the idea was to prevent people obviously walking along there. Now this is a relatively modern postcard. It's still for sale in Swanage today, and you can see that the tin roof building has been replaced with a stone building, and this was actually designed by the vicar of Swanage. He, before he was ordained, was an architect, and so they replaced that old building with a modern building, and it's still small. I mean, you know, the footprint hasn't changed really, but it has got toilets, that kind of thing. And so that is the view that you would see of the mill pond today if you were to visit Swanage. Although it's going to change even more, isn't it? You know, if you went back in 20 years' time, there would be changes. There always are. But I think those views of the mill pond show us that there can be subtle changes, but they are important, especially if you want that specific view where your ancestors lived. Now, the postcard on the left here is from a reproduction postcard, and so that image has come from a book, and it doesn't have a date that is definitive, but you can see there's no wall at all around it, and you can see some definite changes with the roofs of those cottages on the far side of the mill pond. This final postcard is obviously not of the mill pond, but I wanted to include it because it shows how images were used for long periods of time. Now, this was posted in 1907, and the image actually went into circulation around 1890. But Mary Eames, who's standing in that doorway, now she died in 1901, so you can see that the postcard after 1901 is out of date, isn't it? The view is out of date because we know through research that Mary Eames had died. And the postcard continued to be in circulation for a long time. But of course, once you get to the First World War, it's more obvious that there has been a passing of time. And so we're more open to the suggestion that the postcard view is out of date. Now, the postcards that I tend to use are from mainly eBay. And if you are looking for cards for your own family history research, whether it's a view or whatever, put in the search what the view is that you want, and then take into account the years that the postcard might have been posted in. But also add in searches for addresses where your ancestors lived, and if you save the search, when there's a match, eBay will email you, and it might be months later, but it is very, very exciting when you do get a match. And I have a postcard sent in 1907 to the address where my ancestors were in 1901 and 1911, and the recipient, not in my family tree, but is known to my ancestors, perhaps a boarder. And I loved the idea that they knew each other. I love the idea that perhaps my ancestors had handled the card. So that's something you can think about doing for your own family as well. Thank you for watching.